Well, good evening, everybody. It's great to sort of see all of you today. Thanks for taking time out of your busy evening to jump on a Zoom call with us. These are pretty exciting for us. We've had kind of an overwhelmingly positive response to doing these, and so it's something I'm hoping we can continue doing. And our goal, as always, is to be really practical, to really just discuss very practical aspects of beekeeping and really keep it to something that you can go and put into place in your bees tomorrow if you want to. And so hopefully we're able to do that, and that's something we really want to continue doing. As we get started here, I want to go over a couple housekeeping items before we jump into the content of tonight. You guys are all on mute and your video's hidden. Since this is a webinar, your videos don't pop up. So feel free to eat dinner, sit around in your sweatpants, pick your nose, whatever you do on Zoom calls. So nobody can see you. So don't worry about it. But we are recording this. So we will send a recording of this webinar out to you guys once it's over. So if you want to go back and rewatch anything, you can. You don't have to furiously scribble notes because you'll be able to go back and watch this webinar once it's done. This is a little different than our last webinar in that there's a Q&A section, there's a chat section, and there's a Q&A section. So if you would, please put your questions into the Q&A box, not the chat box. It makes it a little easier on our end to answer those questions. So if you would, go ahead and make sure that when you ask questions, put them in that Q&A box rather than the chat box. We are also discussing how to handle these Zoom calls in the future. They've gotten pretty huge pretty fast, and that is really exciting for us. At the very end, we're going to put up a poll, and it'll ask you guys it'll show a variety of topics, and it'll ask what you guys would like to learn about next. And where we want to start shifting with these is we want to open it up with very practical beekeeping knowledge. What do you need to be doing in your bees in Texas this coming month? And then so we want to open with that in the long term, and then we want to shift to other practical topics that may or may not be seasonal. And we'll also have other speakers jumping in. So you guys won't just have to watch me every single month. We want to bring in other speakers, other topic experts. So watch for these things to evolve. If you have suggestions, feel free to let us know. Also, since this group is getting so large, it's pretty impossible for me to speak and answer all the questions at the same time. So I brought James and Sherry Elam onto the call. And James and Sherry, if you guys want to show your faces. There you go. There they are. And you guys are still on mute. But James and Sherry, there you go. Perfect. James and Sherry are some of the instructors that we work with in Texas Bee Supply. They teach a lot of our beekeeping classes. They're expert beekeepers. And what we're going to do is, as I'm speaking through tonight's topics, you guys can be putting any questions you have into that Q&A box, and they're going to answer them in real time. So don't wait until the end to ask all your questions, because then it'll be a flood of 100 questions and we won't be able to get to all of them. So as I'm talking and presenting, start putting questions into that Q&A box, and James and Sherry are going to be answering them in real time. So hopefully that'll be helpful, and hopefully we'll get all the questions answered by doing that. So, and James and Sherry, if you guys could just keep an eye on the chat box too, in case somebody accidentally puts a question in there. But in general, guys, use that Q&A box rather than the chat box. One other super exciting thing, and we'll be done with announcements and get to the meat and potatoes, but Sherry's been working incredibly hard on our newest endeavor. And so I'm going to let her take it away and talk about a new educational opportunity for you guys.
Well, I hope that a good number of you have already gotten something really special in your inbox over the last 24, 48 hours. We are so proud to have launched the brand new Texas Bee Supply monthly magazine. And I can't tell you how excited Blake and I both are for it to already to be out there, because we've worked very hard over the last few weeks to get it to you. But what it is, if you haven't seen it, it's an online all digital magazine where it is interactive, where you can go inside the pages and actually have clickable links and videos. Blake, may I pull it up and
Please.
let's let the folks see what I've got. I think that it's going to be right here, but I'm going to minimize. Y'all know that this Zoom stuff is one of those things that we are learning every single day. So you bear with me here just a second. I've had it all worked out, but you know how that is. Oh, I'm going to make it full screen. Look at this. Isn't that gorgeous? Can you see it? I hope
we're seeing your email there, Sherry.
Oh, are you? Well,
we are, yeah. Yeah.
Great. Well, it should be this. I've got it in front of me. Let's put this as my apologies. I'm going to minimize that. Get that out of the way. How's this?
I think it's still loading, Sherry. I think it's trying to minimize.
There we go. Is it there for you now?
Not yet. No.
Well, I'll tell you what I'll do, because I've got it on my screen. Since y'all aren't being able to see it, we'll just go back. Blake, take the screen. And let me just tell you about it, because, you know, with this, us sharing screens back and forth, there may be, you know, it may not want to do mine. That's fine. It shows on my end, and I'll just walk through it. So what we've got is page by page, and if you don't have it in your inbox, feel free to email us, or in the link that we'll send you for this webinar, you'll get a link to do it, to join or to gather that magazine to your inbox each month. But let me tell you a little bit about it. What we've got is articles on pertinent right now, what should be going on in your hive, but then beyond. It's got videos of Blake working the bees. We've got honey extraction planned. We've got local to you regional reports set up for next month, advanced bee topics. We're going to have speakers coming in that are incredible and writing articles for it. Gosh, where do I go? Future articles, bee clubs. That's a great, James just reminded me of bee clubs. Those of you who are members of bee clubs out there, if you've got something you want to share with us, we want to put it in there. We want to promote you as a club. Small businesses, if you're a small honey producer, small wax producer, and you've got something interesting you want to tell us about, we want to hear about it. I want you to go into this magazine with an aha, I can't believe what I'm seeing moment, because when Blake and I were working on this to begin with, it's like incredibly the tool that it is for you for a small scale beekeeper all the way up to advanced beekeeper. You're going to be blown away by what is right at your fingertips. And recipe of the month, we've got recipe of the month. We're going to do next month is going to be awesome. We're going to do products of the hive, and I know Blake's working on several things. Questions, Q&A, you know, all through the month. Blake gets questions, we get questions. Why not let's post some of those in the magazine, in the publication, because there's other beekeepers just like you that have those same questions that we could probably answer 1,000 people instead of just a couple at a time. So we're really, really excited about that. Submissions, if you've got ideas for our publication, please submit anything that you've got. We'll review it and see if we can find a spot for you, because we're looking at, this issue is 35 pages, right, Blake? We're looking at probably 50 pages for next August edition. So we want to see your pictures. We want to hear all about it. Send those submissions to editor@texasbeesupply.com. What else you want to add on that, Blake?
Yeah, other than that, Sherry did a tremendous amount of work on it. It's a lot of work.
It was a blast. It was a blast.
It was a great.
I'm sorry I couldn't thumb through it. We'll have to work on that for next month.
Yeah, so the only note I would make, one of the things that I love the most about this magazine is that it's being digital, like Sherry said, you can play videos. We're going to put a lot more videos in it even next time. And you can just play those right inside the magazine. Like it's an all digital magazine. So it really, you can interact with it a lot more than a lot of normal magazines. The only other thing I would note is that in the follow-up email that we're going to send out to you guys once this webinar is over, there'll be a link to that magazine. So it's completely free. We're not charging anything for it. And so you will get that link, and you should have already got it if you're one of our customers. But if you didn't, it'll be in the follow-up email to this webinar. So yeah, that's it.
Great. That's
Awesome.
Thanks, Blake.
Okay. Yeah, well, thanks, James and Sherry. And I can see you guys already have
James, by the way.
Yes, James.
Yeah, thank you. Those of you that know Sherry and I, or have attended our classes or our seminars, know that we totally believe that education is the key to successful beekeeping. And we are so fortunate to be associated with Texas Bee Supply and the Shook family because they exemplify that concept.
They sure do.
Education is the key to what we're all doing. We encourage you to continue asking your questions tonight. We see a lot of them coming through. And Sherry and I are fixing to jump right on and help you to the best of our ability.
I better start the presentation.
That's right. That's right. Thanks, Blake. We'll be on. Thanks.
All right, guys. So I'm going to jump into the PowerPoint here, and we're gonna get rolling. So this is a pretty long PowerPoint, quite a few slides, and so I am going to roll through this pretty aggressively because, again, there's a lot of material to get through. This is such an important month. And so I really want to get through all the material that I can and then ask those questions to James and Sherry. And I'm just going to scoot. And you guys, again, we're going to share all this with you so you don't have to take notes. And then we'll go from there. And guys, just as a reminder, if you're not on mute, go ahead and put yourself on mute. And then James and Sherry, if you guys could put yourself on mute as well. I don't think, James, I don't think you're on mute there. So put yourself on mute and we'll get rolling. Okay, so first things first, you guys are probably all aware of this, but if we don't get to your questions tonight because there's too many of them, shoot those to help@texasbeesupply.com. If you have other questions on an ongoing basis, feel free to shoot them that email address and we'll try to answer those as quickly as we can. Just as a reminder, if you're ever sending us questions, please, if it's applicable, send us a picture of what you're talking about because that really helps so much when we can see what we're talking about. So, all right. So, this is a very depressing picture, but I have to throw it in there anyway. Once we get into the hot summer months, watch those smokers. This was a good friend of mine. This was actually last year. He set the smoker down in the wrong place in the middle of the summer, and this is what happened. So watch those smokers. They can absolutely start a fire. So make sure when you're bringing your smoker to the bee yard, a lot of people bring a metal bucket that they can set it in rather than setting it onto the grass because unfortunately, beehives burn quite well. All that wax, all that honey, pretty flammable. So watch those smokers. Okay, so this is not a slide you would expect to see in July, right? I mean, it looks nice. I mean, I think my body temperature dropped about 10 degrees just looking at it. But this time of year, it's, we think of summer management, right? I mean, it's July. I mean, winter is months away, especially in Texas, right? And so a question I'm often asked is why on earth do we talk about winter management in July? And the reason is once you harvest honey, which is for most folks in Texas is late June, early July, as soon as you harvest honey, that's when winter preparation begins. Because if you don't start preparing your hive properly for winter right now, it's not going to make it. And by the time winter actually gets here, they'll be in such a weakened state that they can't survive. So winter preparation does not begin when that first cold front blows in October. It begins when you harvest your honey. So this is also I'm sorry about all the sad pictures I'm showing today, but this is also a sad picture. The honey flow is over for the vast majority of regions in Texas. It's gone. The picture on the far left here is Gaillardia or pincushion. Gaillardia or Indian blanket. That middle picture is Scabiosa or pincushion. The fuzzy picture on the far right is what's left of a tallow tassel from Southeast Texas. all of our wildflowers are starting to burn up and dry up. And we've had some nice rains a couple weeks ago that was certainly helped. But at this point, for the vast majority of the state, the honey flow is pretty much completely over. And that's unfortunate, but expected. So we're starting to see some summer blooms now. That we're seeing some of the summer sunflowers start blooming. The crepe myrtles are blooming. We're seeing some thistles there in the middle, that beautiful purple flower. The sumac on the far right is blooming. Vitex is kind of shutting down. The horse mint has kind of shut down, but we are starting to see some native summer blooming plants come on board. However, and this is something we're going to talk about a lot tonight, that doesn't always mean that we're in the free and clear and don't have to worry about our bees, because we're starting to see some summer blooms. So in most regions of Texas, there's pretty limited summer blooming flowers. I mean, you see some, but nothing like we see in the springtime. And we're going to talk about why that's so important in just a moment. So let's throw out some prerequisites before we really get into summer management. What do bees really need in order to grow and to thrive? They need protein, number one, and that's pollen for the bees. That's pollen. They need a variety of pollen, so they don't just need a little bit of pollen trickling in. They need a variety of pollen to grow and thrive. They need carbohydrates, which is nectar or syrup. That's the honey. That's the carbs in their diet. They need to be largely mite-free, so 2 mites per 100 bees or below. And we're going to talk about mites quite a bit later, so we'll talk about what that means. They need to be largely free of brood diseases, and they need to have a healthy and vibrant queen. So those are the things that your hive really needs to have in order to grow and to thrive. And so we're going to kind of tackle each one of those things as it applies to Texas and to summer, in order to make sure you're doing those techniques properly so that you can have a hive that thrives through the summer and thus survives the winter. I find this slide fascinating, and I don't know why. I love showing it, but it really shows, as you can read, the average use of products for one beehive per year. So 44 pounds of pollen per hive per year. This is what bees naturally eat. 264 pounds of nectar, 26 quarts of water, and then 7 ounces of resin or pollen. Now you're probably thinking, yeah, my bees didn't bring in 264 pounds of honey. Well, 2 caveats. One, that's nectar, which is lighter than honey. That's before it's been diluted down into honey. And then secondarily, they eat the vast majority of what they bring in, and they only store the surplus, which is what we can harvest. So it takes a lot of resources for these hives to thrive for a full year. And when we have a drought year, which isn't uncommon here in Texas, if we have a year where the summer is especially hot and dry, which is kind of what we're shaping up to see this year, then we have to supplement those bees. We have to give them something else other than what would naturally come in, because they can't bring in everything that they need if it's a really dry year. So there's a really good book called Fat Bees, Skinny Bees. And, we're conditioned to think that, for us as humans, we want to be as thin as possible. And the more junk food we eat, the reverse happens. For bees, the more junk food they eat, the thinner they get. I mean, how fortunate are they, right? I mean, but for bees, if they don't have a great source of carbs and a great source of protein, then they tend to get skinny and they lose weight, and the fat cells in their body begin to disappear. And those fat cells in their bodies, we've come to know that those play a critical role in the bee's immune system and their ability to create royal jelly and feed it to baby bees. And so if the bees are starved nutritionally, if they don't have the pollen and the nectar coming in like they would in the springtime, then those adult bees, their fat cells begin to shrink in their bodies, and they can't properly rear brood, and they are more susceptible to disease and viruses from the Varroa mites. So as beekeepers, one of the most critical things we can do over the summer is make sure that we are providing our bees, if they need it, a supplemental protein source and a supplemental carbohydrate source in order to keep those fat cells healthy in a bee so that they can raise the brood that they need to stay strong, and that they can resist the diseases and the viruses from the mites. So this is summer versus spring pollen. Now you can probably guess which is which. The picture on the right is a picture I took this spring of pollen in the hive. And it's not uncommon to see frames of pollen in the early spring or sometimes in the late winter when there's so many flowers blooming that the bees are just bringing pollen in constantly, and they can fill a frame with pollen. And that's wonderful. That's one of the things that allows bees to grow so rapidly in the springtime is all the pollen they're bringing in. The picture on the left, on the other hand, obviously is a frame of brood. You can see that there's brood, but you can see, I went through several hives this morning, actually. I went through 300 or 400 hives here in North Texas this morning, and I never found in all of them a frame of pollen like you see on the right there. What I would always find is the picture you see on your left, which is a frame of brood with some scatterings of cells of nectar and then some cells that have pollen in them. And you can see, maybe you can see my pointer here. Yeah, it's not easy to see, but there's a few little cells of, pollen kind of tucked in amongst this brood. And that's just not much pollen. When I get to the point in the summer, especially when I'm not seeing half a frame of pollen somewhere in the hive, if I'm only seeing kind of scattered pollen throughout a frame, that tells me that it's time for me to start taking action and supplementing pollen or protein for the bees, because to raise brood, it takes a couple pounds of pollen to raise a frame of brood. And so if the bees aren't bringing in and storing a ton of pollen, they're going to start shutting down brood production. And so a couple weeks ago, I was still seeing these nice half frames full of pollen or a full frame of pollen. And I'm just not seeing that all of a sudden. It seems like every week the pollen gets less and less and less. And this morning, actually, when I was going through those hives, I actually put pollen patties on all of them because I just wasn't seeing the pollen stores that I'm comfortable, that I really want to see. This is an interesting picture too. Oops, let me go back. Well-fed bees versus, this is a picture of well-fed bees. You can see the picture on the left is the top bars in a hive. And you probably have heard beekeepers talk about whitening the comb. And it's usually a sign that bees are kind of bringing in an excess of nectar or you're feeding them well. And that's when you can just see along the side of the box here and kind of between the frames, some of that pretty white new comb. And that's always a great sign to see. It means the bees have enough food coming in that they're drawing out some new comb. The picture on the right is just a frame of brood, and you can see all the way around that frame of brood, they've got nectar stored, which is or honey or syrup, which is a great sign. It's not a frame of brood with no ring of nectar or honey around it. They've got this nice, pretty ring of nectar and capped honey around the brood, which again, that's really what I want to see in a well-fed hive. Okay, so this is huge. All right, so this is something a lot of people don't talk about, but it's a critical thing to tell how your bees are doing as far as having enough nutrition and if they're fed properly or if they're bringing in enough food. Are the larvae, the developing larvae, well-fed or hungry? So the picture on the right is a picture of well-fed larvae. So these are newly hatched larvae that the adult bees, the nurse bees, feed larvae 5,000 to 8,000 times per in the 5.5 day period that they're in the larval stage before the bees cap over that cell and that larva starts turning into a pupa. So they're fed constantly, and they need to be in order to grow properly. And so on the picture on the right, you can see that these larvae are just floating, literally floating in royal jelly, which is what you want to see. You want to see that the bees are floating those larvae. And what that means is they are going to develop into healthy adult worker bees. Now the picture on the left, a little harder to see, but you can zoom in on your computer, or especially if you're on a tablet or smartphone, you can actually zoom in. But if you notice around those larvae, there's not much royal jelly. It almost looks a little dry around it. They're not floating in a puddle of royal jelly like the ones on the right. And so that's something I always start looking for this time of year. Do I see pollen stores in my hive? What do the larvae look like? Are they floating in that royal jelly, which indicates the bees have all the food they need, or are they starting to look kind of dry? And remember, bees need protein and syrup and carbs in order to fully feed those little larvae. The danger of underfed larvae this time of year is over the summer, the bees are rearing the baby bees that are going to overwinter. And so if the summer larvae that are being reared are not fed properly, then those bees aren't going to be able to live as long, which means as fall and winter approaches, those bees that were supposed to live over the winter start dying because they weren't fed properly over the summer, didn't have the nutrients they needed over the summer. So making sure your hive has the protein and the carbs needed over the summer is really important. I know larvae can be a little hard to see. A little trick you might try is find a frame that has a lot of larvae in it and go out to your bee yard when it's really sunny and hold that frame so that the sun is shining right down in the cells, okay? And then get your smartphone and take a video, okay? And several pictures, real slow. Take a real slow video looking down into those cells and then take a few pictures. And then go back inside and you can zoom in. Most smartphones these days have good enough cameras that you can zoom way into those cells to see what they look like. And a lot of times that's easier than just using your eyes. And same thing for looking for eggs. Take a bunch of really close-up pictures, making sure it's focusing properly, and then zoom in and on your phone, and that can help you out there. Okay, so one of the ways to achieve that continual growth and thriving of bees over the summer is what I call trickle feeding, okay? Now this is a really important thing to do if you want to make sure your hive is healthy and thrives as much as possible. And it's not practical for everybody, and so we're going to talk about that later, what to do if if your bees are an hour from where you live. But if it's possible, this is so good for the bees. It's trickle feeding, because remember, bees in nature like to grow when there's a honey flow in the springtime, when there's a constant stream of pollen, when there's a constant stream of nectar coming in. That's when they grow best, because that tells the queen, hey, there's a whole lot of food coming in, raise bees. And it tells the nurse bees, hey, we've got plenty of food coming in, so feed those larvae everything they need. So if you are able to, trickle feeding over the summer months, July, August, September, is amazing. And what that is it's feeding a smaller amount of food, both pollen patties and syrup, over a longer period of time. So for pollen substitute, it would look like feeding, I'm going to say 1 to 2 1-pound pollen patties per month, okay, starting now. Now the caveat there is you don't ever want to feed more pollen substitute patty than can be eaten in 1 week. And we'll talk about why that's important in just a minute. And then for sugar syrup, you would feed 1/4 to 1/2 gallon per week until the hive has at least 30 pounds stored in the second box, okay? So the concept is, as the name says, it's giving them a trickle of food as they are trying to survive the summer. Instead of giving them a whole dump of food, instead of harvesting honey, putting those supers back on and giving them 5 gallons of syrup and 3 pollen patties where they get it all in one big rush, it's basically trickling that feed throughout the summer. And that's going to simulate a nectar flow and a pollen flow, because the bees are going to constantly have this source of food. And so they're going to typically grow much faster and much better with that slow trickle rather than a sudden dump of food. And we're going to get into some details on all this too. So one thing to mention is well-fed bees versus overfed bees, because you can feed too much. And in the picture on the left is a hive that is being overfed. The picture on the right is the one you've already seen, which is a hive that is being fed properly. So what you've got to watch out for is on the left there, you can see that you've got a little bit of brood, right? So you've got a little bit of brood up in that upper left-hand corner. You've got a kind of a scattering of capped brood throughout the hive, but they filled all this brood nest area in with nectar or syrup, more likely. And that's not good, because now the queen doesn't have anywhere to lay. And so you want it more like the picture on the right, where you've got a lot of brood in the middle, and then you've got a good healthy band of syrup or honey around the edge of that brood. So if you're seeing this picture on the left, where in the brood nest, so I'm not talking about the outside frames, but in the brood area in that bottom box, so the middle 6 frames or so in the bottom box, if they're filling all that area where the queen should be laying with nectar or syrup, that's a sign you're feeding too much or too fast, and you need to slow it down some. So what you're really going for is what you see on the right, which is frames of brood with that band of nectar and honey around it. So feeding pollen substitute. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about that. So what type of pollen substitute should you be feeding? Because I talked about feeding 1 to 2 patties, 1 to 2 1-pound patties starting now through the summer. So if you do much research online, hopefully you don't do too much of that with beekeeping because you never know what you're going to find. There's a lot of recipes out there for homemade patties, and they're usually a combination of brewer's yeast, soy flour, a few other things mixed together with syrup and fed to the bees. So unfortunately, there have been some studies done on this. Homemade pollen patties are not very good for the bees. Brewer's yeast and soy flour, they are a protein source, but they're a very, very poor protein source for the bees. So in general, I wouldn't recommend a homemade recipe for making your own. It just doesn't have the nutrients that the bees need. You may have heard about dry feeding. So this is where you would take a dry pollen powder, pollen substitute powder. I mean, we sell this, we sell it in the patty form or the dry powder form. And you would put this out and the bees will actually go forage on it like they would pollen. This typically only works during an extreme dearth. So during a time when there's no flowers blooming, which is typically not until the dead of winter. So the dry feeding, where you're just putting a dry powder out and the bees are foraging on it, usually only works late November, December into January. And we'll talk a lot more about dry feeding as we get closer to winter. But it doesn't usually work over the summer. Pre-made patties, this is what I usually recommend. It's a pre-made 1-pound patty that you can just put right into the hive. If you mix up your own patties, so you can buy the dry powder and mix up the patties yourself. It's a little cheaper. Couple of quick notes on that is that you need to make sure that you're using corn syrup, unfortunately, or you don't want to use sucrose. So you can use ProSweet, which is what we sell, or corn syrup, but you don't want to use sugar syrup or honey. If you use sugar syrup, that patty will dry out and get really, really hard. If you use honey, you don't usually want to feed honey to bees because it can transmit diseases from whatever hive that honey came from. So if you're mixing up your own, you want to use what we sell, which is a ProSweet or corn syrup. And you also want to make sure that it's about the consistency of peanut butter. That's the consistency you're going for when you mix up your own pollen substitute. A lot of the bags of pollen substitute, the dry powder bags, come with directions on making a wet mix. And so that's actually where you would take that powder and you kind of create a slurry, mix it with syrup and make a slurry and put it in the feeder. And the bees drink it like they do syrup, but it's got a lot of protein in it. Great concept, works horribly in the South because small hive beetles love it. They think you just made them like this swimming pool of food and they go nuts over it. So in the southern states, Texas, I don't recommend doing that wet mix because the small hive beetles will make a mess of it. As far as the brand, what I use commercially, what I recommend is Ultra Bee or Bee Pro, which is, we have the Ultra Bee at Texas Bee Supply. And it's a great patty. I mean, we use it on our several thousand commercial hives. It's a fantastic pollen substitute. In my opinion, it's the best one on the market at the moment. So placing the pollen patty, it just goes right between the boxes. So right on top of the brood nest, underneath the second box you've got on your hive. Simple as that. Just goes right between. They're flat enough and thin enough that it can go right between those boxes. So some common questions about feeding pollen substitute is, a big one is, what about small hive beetles? Because small hive beetles do love pollen patties. It's I think their favorite food. So the key to not letting small hive beetles, because adults will lay eggs in that pollen patty, which will hatch into larvae, which can really make a mess. So the key there is to not give that hive, like we talked about, more than they can eat in about a week. So a really good strong hive, if you've got 2 boxes full of bees, they can go through about a pound in a week, no problem. If you got a weaker hive, so it's maybe not quite 1 deep full of bees, then I would just give them about a half a patty and go back and check in a week. And if they haven't eaten it all, you can pull it out throw it in the freezer to kill any small hive beetle eggs, and then give it back to the bees, and they can keep eating it. How much is too much? You can't really overfeed pollen substitute. It's not, you know, if the bees don't, if it's too much, they'll just kind of chew it up and throw it out the front door of the hive. But you can't really overfeed on it, as long as you're not giving them more than they can eat in about a week to help prevent those small hive beetles. Another common question is, should I feed pollen substitute if the bees are bringing in pollen? So I want to talk for just a quick second about the dangers of single source pollen. And this is what we often see in the summer months. So it can be a little deceitful, because especially you see this in the fall as well. You might see your bees bringing in pollen, okay? And you might see some pollen in your hive. But when I start getting concerned is when I'm not seeing a very much of a variety of pollen flowers blooming in the summertime. And if I'm seeing primarily just one color of pollen stored in the hive, I get a little concerned, because all pollens are not created equal. I mean, some flowers make much higher quality pollens and higher protein content pollens than others. And so you might see pollen coming in, especially in summer months. If it's primarily one color though, I'm usually feeding those pollen patties, because again, it's probably not providing the proper nutrition for the bees. And so what I really want to see is a wide variety of colors. I want to see a lot of flowers blooming. And that's when maybe you don't need to feed, as long as there's enough of it in the hive. You're seeing those half frames or so full of pollen. But if it's all single source, I get pretty concerned. Now, what if your hive's already very strong? Again, if you're seeing those dry larvae, if you're not seeing a half frame of pollen or so stored in the hive, you're not seeing multicolored pollen, even if your hive is strong, I would still feed it pollen substitute, because it's going to help keep them strong. It's going to help keep that queen going, and it's going to provide the nutrients those bees need in order to raise proper bees that are going to be able to overwinter well. Just a quick little thing on small hive beetles. I mean, we talked about them. You can see here the mess that they make in the hive. And, you know, you can use, we sell these little traps that, and I'll link to it in the notes that we follow up on this email, follow up on this webinar with. But we can put little traps in the hive that'll help trap and kill the adult small hive beetles. Those are great. I mean, they're really cheap, they're really easy to use, and they can help keep the small hive beetles at bay if you've got a problem with them. Okay, so let's summarize some of that into a practical format before we go to some new topics, okay? So I'm gonna say that this is kind of what I've outlined here is kind of your minimum summer care, okay? This is what you need to be doing at a minimum. So after harvesting, so I presume you've harvested, or if you're not, you're about to. If you haven't, you should pretty quick, because the bees are going to start eating all that honey. So after you harvest, and I'm making the assumption that you've harvested essentially all the honey out of the upper boxes of your hives, which is fine. I'm going to assume that your bottom box, your deep box, is your brood box, and then your second box is empty, okay? So after you've harvested, feed your hives until they have 30 pounds of excess honey stored in a second box, okay? Now, if you've already got 30 pounds of honey stored in a second box, then you can just give them a little bit of trickle food, syrup-wise, and to maybe make sure they maintain that 30 pounds. By the way, 30 pounds, as you see in the notes here, 30 pounds is about one medium box, 90% full of honey, or one deep box, about 2/3 full of honey. And then your goal is to maintain that 30, I'm going to say 30 to 40 pound surplus in the upper boxes over the course of the summer. You want to test and treat for mites now, right now. And we're going to talk about this in a minute. And then you want to feed 2 pollen patties each month, August through October. Okay. So that's kind of the minimum summer care. Right? Especially if you live a long way from your hives, if you're not able to visit them frequently, this is kind of at minimum what you ought to be doing over the summer. Okay, this is if you really want to do everything you can and you live close by to your bees and you want to just grow them as much as you can, then you want to practice trickle feeding. Okay, so feed that 1/4 to 1/2 gallon of syrup per week until there's at least 30 pounds stored in the second super. This should take, assuming that second box is pretty much empty when you start, this will take 2 to 3 months to achieve, assuming your hive is growing. Add Pro Health to each feeding with syrup. And so you can see a picture of it there on the right. It's an essential oil mixture. It's great for the bees. Helps boost their immune system a little bit, helps them drink the syrup, also prevents syrup from spoiling. But that Pro Health mixture is fantastic. Again, you want to test and treat for mites right now. Don't delay on that. And we'll talk about it, but we're in peak season for mites right now. Feed Pro DFM, and there's a picture of that, or Super DFM, I should say. It's not Pro, it's Super DFM. Picture on the right there as well. But this is awesome. It's a probiotic, and you can mix it with your feed, or you can get a dust and dust it on the top bars. It really just boosts their immune system and helps keep any brood diseases at bay. You can equalize brood between hives if needed. So if you've got 5 hives and one is super strong and 2 are okay and 1 is weak, you can take frames of brood out of a really strong hive, maybe 1 or 2 frames of brood at a time, shake the bees off, and transfer those frames of brood to the weaker hives to kind of boost their strength. And then you can consider summer splits or drawing out excess comb, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So this is more spelling out for you ideal. I mean, this is what I do. I mean, it's what I do all summer long with bees. Most of my bees are in North Dakota and Minnesota right now, where it's a balmy 70 degrees and spring is just starting, and they're bringing in nectar like crazy and pollen like crazy. But I also usually end up having a lot of bees here in North Texas or the Houston area over the summer as well. And so bees that I've got commercially in Texas over the summer, this is what I'm doing to make sure that they stay as healthy. And the cool thing about this is when I practice this, they actually grow over the summer. I mean, they don't just maintain, they actually thrive. One quick note here, summer brood, you'll see it's not infrequent. It's not that uncommon to see what I'm going to call summer brood, where the queen's laying pattern can just get a little spotty. And you can see that the bees are kind of, and I showed this picture earlier, the bees are kind of filling those cells full of pollen and nectar and syrup full, and the queen is kind of having to start laying around them. And this is, if I'm seeing this throughout the hive, one of two things is happening. One, my queen's failing. That's a possibility. Or secondarily, if it's a newer queen, then I'm going to say that the hive is just starting to shut the queen down. Okay, so they're starting to kind of say, you know what, there's no flowers blooming. We're not being fed. We're running out of protein. We got to start shutting down brood rearing. And so you kind of start seeing this kind of spotty brood. And however, if you're feeding that trickle method and you're giving them protein, then usually this will start to go away. Especially Super DFM will help with this, because it's going to make sure that any brood diseases they might even have a little bit of, it'll help wipe those out. So anyway, some little helpful tips there. All right, so let's talk about, so you're putting all this effort into your hives, right? And you're feeding them, you're giving them pollen substitute, and let's say you're following that trickle ideal method. You're going to need to put your bees to work, because if you do all that properly, your hive is going to start growing in some cases, which again is wonderful, because that means they're going to go into the winter just in fantastic strength. So I want to give you some options for if you pursue that ideal method and do the trickle feed method. Here's some things you can do to keep your bees busy during the summer, because they're going to be able to work. So one idea is you can have them draw out foundation for next year. So if you're newer to beekeeping, or even if you're not, getting bees to draw out foundation, it's a lot of work for the bees. And if you're having them draw out foundation in the springtime on using natural nectar coming in, I always feel like it's a bit of a waste, because natural nectar or honey, that's worth a lot in money, and we want to eat it, right? And so if the bees are using it to draw out foundation, well, that's honey we could be eating if they weren't using it to draw out foundation. And it takes about 11 pounds of honey to make 1 pound of wax. So I would rather my bees draw out all that foundation on syrup that's costing me 50 cents a pound instead of honey that's worth $8 a pound. So you can take these hives that are really growing and strong, and you can add a box of foundation on top of them, and then practice that trickle feeding. And over the course of the summer, they'll draw out that box of foundation. And now you've got your foundation drawn out for next year. The text there, what are your goals? And I just realized I'm watching myself in a different device, and I'm pointing that way. It's mirrored, so I need to point that way when I'm talking about the text. So what are your goals? You know, if your goal is to make a lot of honey next year, if you want to draw out honey supers, then you can put mediums on over the summer and get them to draw out medium boxes for them to store honey in next year. If you really want to grow bees in 2021, then you can have them draw out deep boxes that you can use to make splits next year. The trickle feeding method is ideal for drawing out that foundation. One caveat here: if you're feeding syrup really all through the summer, even if you're, no matter what you're doing, I tend to recommend 1-to-1 syrup. Okay, so 1 part sugar to 1 part water. Or if you're buying like the pre-made syrup that we sell, you're going to put about 25% water to whatever ratio of syrup you've got. So if you've got a gallon of syrup from us, you're going to put about a quart of water in with that gallon of syrup and kind of dilute it down. And the reason is the bees don't need a really, really thick 2-to-1 syrup over the course of the summer, because they'll tend, with the thicker syrups, they tend to store it, which is what we want them to do in the winter. But in the summertime, we want them to use it to just grow bees and draw out foundation rather than just store it for use. So this is a bit different. I often recommend 2-to-1 all the time, because if you go too thin on syrup, it can ferment and the bees won't drink it. So if they're drinking it, it's okay. It means that it's not fermenting and you didn't make it too thin. But I still err on the side of a little thicker than 1-to-1 just to be safe. But you can make a thinner syrup over the summer months. In our magazine, our Texas Bee Supply Monthly, I'm going to write an article soon, maybe the August edition, maybe the September edition. But I'm going to write a whole article on 1-to-1 versus 2-to-1, because it's confusing to a lot of folks, and to me too sometimes. And so I'm going to kind of dig into that topic, and so watch for that down the road. The other thing you can do to keep your bees busy is make summer splits. If you're doing this ideal method where you're feeding the protein and the syrup and the trickle method, then your bees are typically going to start growing, and you can make splits in the summer, which is kind of cool. I mean, the bees, July is the ideal month to make those summer splits. You ideally don't want to split later than August 15th, because it usually takes, if you're using 4 frames of brood in the split, it usually takes about 2 months for the bees to get back to peak strength after you make that split. So August 15th takes you to October 15th, which is usually when we start getting cold fronts. And so I don't like doing splits past August 15th. You want to make sure you use at least 4 frames of brood per split. You're going to need to be prepared to feed a lot, because that split has a lot of growing to do once you make it. You've got to use mated queens when you make splits. You don't want to use queen cells or let them raise their own, because in the summertime, there aren't many drones. And then it's critical that you have your mite populations under control to do summer splits. But July summer splits, fantastic option. And if you use the trickle method on those splits, then it's no problem to grow them up to full strength before winter gets here. Now, I know that summer splits is a whole other topic. And so it's way more than I can get into on tonight's call. So we actually have next week, July 9th, we have a virtual splits class. It's an hour and a half. We try to make it cheap, $29 a person. And we're going to talk, I'm going to talk all about how to make summer splits in Texas. And I'm going to go over every detail of it. We'll get into a lot of depth on how to prep your bees for it, when to do it, how to find queens. I mean, we'll get into all the nuts and bolts of summer splits and how to do it successfully. And that's next week. I know it's not a whole lot of lead time, but I wanted to do it next week, because if you're going to do splits again, I recommend doing it in July. And so we wanted to do it at the beginning of July to give you time to make those splits. One thing I'm also going to do, I'm doing a lot of summer splits next week, actually Monday. I'm going to go out and do, I've got to make a couple hundred summer splits myself. And so I'm going to take a bunch of videos while I'm doing that, and that we'll use in that virtual class. And so I'm going to film 15 or 20 minutes worth of video of me out there doing summer splits. So it's not just going to be a PowerPoint, it'll also be a video that you can watch. So anyway, hope to see you there. And in the follow-up email to this webinar, I'll put a link to sign up for that class if you're interested. Okay, so let's talk about Varroa mites. And the little subtitle there is not an exaggeration: the leading cause of hive death in small-scale beekeepers. And I would edit that to say it's leading cause of hive death, period, not just in small-scale beekeepers, for sideline beekeepers and commercial beekeepers. It is horrible. The Varroa mites came into the U.S. in the 1990s, pretty much devastated the entire domestic population of bees. So the Varroa population typically hits critical levels in July and August, usually July in Texas. So right now is when those levels peak. It's the leading cause of winter death. And I put winter in air quotes there because oftentimes Varroa mites don't usually just outright kill a hive in the summer, okay? Once they reach that more than 2 mites per 100 bees, once they get up to 3 or 4 or 10 or 20 mites per 100 bees, they really start damaging the health of the colony. They spread viruses, they weaken it, and so they make the bees unhealthy, and so the hive just starts declining. Doesn't kill it outright, but they start going downhill in strength. They don't often actually die until the fall, late fall or winter time. And so when a lot of beekeepers go out in the fall or winter and see dead hives and they assume, oh, well, I guess it got too cold, or, it's a winter loss. Well, that loss started way back in the summer when the mites weren't killed like they should have been. So it's so important to keep Varroa mites under control. I tell people all the time that if you can feed properly and treat Varroa mites properly, you're probably going to be a very successful beekeeper. Those are the 2 most important things. And a visual inspection is virtually pointless. So don't be looking for Varroa mites in your hives, because they like to live underneath bees where it's actually very hard to see. And then the worst damage they do is underneath the capped brood. So again, don't rely on a visual inspection. So I've got a video here, and I'm going to attempt to play it. Sometimes these things don't stream too well through Zoom. And so if it's really choppy, then I'm going to just pause it. And I am going to send a link to this video out in the follow-up email that'll go out hopefully tomorrow. But this is how to test for Varroa mites, which is absolutely critical. Make sure you're testing your hives. It's really simple, but test your hives, and then chances are you're going to need to treat after that. So let's see if this works.
Hey guys, Blake with Texas Bee Supply here. So today I want to show you guys how to do a mite test. Now this is probably one of the most important things to learn how to do and to practice regularly.
Yeah, that's not really working. So I've got a second screen set up here so I can watch the presentation as well as while I'm doing it. It looks like it's super choppy, so I apologize about that. By next Zoom call, I'm going to figure out, I'm trying to get hardwired internet instead of Wi-Fi, which should be able to stream these videos a lot better. So we're short on time anyway. So I'll send the follow-up, in the follow-up email, there'll be a link, and I would really recommend you watch that video, how to test for mites. It's really easy, and make sure you're testing and treating for mites. It's a make or break thing in beekeeping. We've got another video I'll link to in that follow-up email as far as how to treat, and I won't spend too much time on that. One of the only things that works really well in the summertime is Apivar, which is the strip you see here on the left. It's really easy. You just stick it in the hive. So I made a video as well. It's under our video blog, but I'll link to it as well in the email on how to treat with Apivar. It works really well, very effective, and very easy to apply, and does a great job at killing mites. The one other thing I would mention on mites is you want to do a follow-up test. So after you treat, and I think this treatment stays in about 40 days, after you pull those strips out, do another test and make sure it actually killed the mites like it was supposed to. So I think that's all I've got on mites. But again, go to our video blog, watch those videos on how to identify mites, how to test for mites, and then how to treat mites. I can't emphasize enough how critical it is, and how many hundreds of emails and phone calls we get in the wintertime of beekeepers who have lost their bees. And my first question is always, did you treat for mites? And if 9 times out of 10, the answer is no, we didn't. And I say, well, chances are that's why you lost your hive. The second thing I always ask is, if they said, yes, I treated for mites, is when did you treat? Because if you waited till August or September, chances are the viruses got so high and the mites got so bad that, that they damage the hive kind of to the point of no return. So it's really important that as soon as you harvest your honey in July, early July, that you treat for mites and that you monitor those mite levels to make sure they don't get out of control. Okay, so bearding. So I want to just touch on this really briefly. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but it's a real common thing in the summertime. And we've kind of got 3 different stages of bearding here in this picture. So the far left, this is actually called washboarding. So it's not actually bearding. It's kind of when the bees, as you can see, are spaced out very properly, social distancing on the front of the hive. And they're kind of like doing this, it almost looks like a washboard movement where they're kind of rocking back and forth. It's not a problem. Doesn't mean there's something wrong with the hive. It's just a very common thing to see. Some hives do it, some don't. It's a bit of a mystery as to why they do it, but it's not a problem, so don't worry about it. The middle picture is, I would say, much more commonly what I would call bearding associated with just being hot. And it's not necessarily a problem, but in the summertime, you know, all during the day, all the foragers are out foraging for whatever they can find in the summer. And then in the evening, all those foragers come back to the hive. And if they all were to pile inside that hive, then it would heat up the hive and overheat the hive. And so they often just hang out on the front in order to keep the hive cool around the inside. And so that's, again, not a problem. The one thing I would note is that you always want to make sure that that top box on your hive it isn't more than 80% full of bees or 80% full of honey. If that top box is more than 80% full, you've got to add a second box to prevent swarming. But if it's not more than 80% full and you've kind of got these bees hanging out on the front, it's not necessarily an issue. The picture on the far right is a little more what I often see in the springtime of a hive preparing to swarm, where you've got more of like this perfect little ball of bees, you know, all throughout the day, not just in the evening. It's like this perfect ball of bees. And that's more what I see when a hive's prepping to swarm. Now, that they only usually stay in that stage a couple days and then they swarm. So if you're seeing it more on an ongoing basis, it doesn't necessarily mean they're swarming. So hopefully that helps you a little bit when it comes to bearding. In lieu of that, you know, keeping the hives cooler, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I know we talked about it on the last call, but screen bottom boards you see in the upper left there, those are great at helping keep hives cooler in Texas. It just gives the bees a lot of ventilation and so a lot of airflow. So those are awesome at helping keep bees cooler. The picture on the upper right there is just an empty shell of a box, so it doesn't have frames in it. But if you just put an empty box on top of your hive and then put the lid on top of that, it kind of creates a dead air space. And that heat from that lid isn't just beating down on top of the hive. That works pretty well too. You can, on that picture on the lower left, you can crack the lid to give the bees an upper entrance or upper airflow. And that works pretty well too. And then of course, the best thing is shade. And that's the picture on the lower right there, is just giving shade to your bees. Ideally, you've got them in a location that gets afternoon shade. At least during the heat of the day, they're not in the full sun. And you can even make a shade screen over the top of your hive. That helps too. Anything to help them stay cooler in the summer months is a great thing to do. Oh, this is, you're probably not gonna be able to see it because these aren't streaming very well, but this is a nook. So this was yesterday actually. So this is a pro nook, and these, they're amazing for spring nooks. So we sell all the nooks that we sell in these pro nooks. They're awesome. They don't do terribly well in the heat though. So that's one of the reasons we only sell complete hives over the summer, like we are right now, not nooks, because the complete hives do fine in the heat, but nooks don't do well. They struggle in that plastic to keep cool. And so you probably won't be able to see it, but basically this little nook was out in the full sun and it completely melted. You can see it's all wet and shiny. It just melted the beeswax on the middle of one of those 100-degree days. So you don't want bees in a little nook box over the summer. They're great for spring, but not summertime. Okay, so post-harvest hive configuration is another thing that I wanted to address just quickly. This is something a lot of people have questions on. You know, once you've harvested your honey, how many boxes should my hive have on it going into the wintertime? Or really into the summertime and then into the winter. And it's decently optional. The critical thing that I would want to convey is that you've got at least 2 boxes. So you've got your bottom brood box, and you want at least 1 more box on top of that. So it can be a medium, it can be a deep. You want at least 2 boxes. If your hive, if that second box gets 80% full, you can add another box. That's no problem. You know, you can have 2 or 3 or 4 boxes over the summer, and that's fine. So you can't really have too many boxes over the summer if the bees are filling them up as they go. But you certainly can have too few, and so you don't want, you do not want less than 2 boxes. The bees will just get too hot oftentimes. So make sure you've got at least 2 boxes on. Once you've harvested your honey, you can certainly return 1 of those or 2 of those boxes back onto the bees, let them clean them up, and then leave the queen excluder off and let the queen move up, lay brood up there over the course of the summer. And then next spring, I'll tell you how to reuse that box as a honey super. Robbing is also an issue. If you read our Texas Bee Supply Monthly magazine, we had a whole article in there about robbing, how to prevent it, what it looks like. And so I'm going to defer to that and not get into as much depth here. One quick note, since we're in the middle of harvesting honey, that I want to make is that once you've harvested your honey, you really want to return those wet supers to your hive in the evening. If you do it in the morning or in the middle of the day, those wet supers that you've just extracted honey out of smell so strongly of honey, it's going to attract all the bees in the neighborhood to come and start robbing that hive. So make sure when you put those boxes back on after you've extracted honey, do it in the evening, and that way the bees in that hive can clean up all those drips of honey overnight, and the next morning won't have much of a strong smell. The other quick note on this is that you want to not use an entrance feeder in the summertime, because it's a lot of syrup right there on the front of the hive. So you want to make sure you use an internal feeder for over the summer feeding. And if you do have robbing occur, don't just plug up your hive. You can certainly seal all the cracks between the boxes, but you don't want to just close up the entrance unless you have a screen bottom board, because they can really overheat. So if robbing does occur, you can just get a wet sheet, put it over the hive, over the whole hive, and make sure that the entrance is still exposed. You can reduce down the entrance, especially if you've got a screen bottom board, because they should stay moving. I know some people that they live in the suburbs, and they say if they have a robbing issue, they turn on their sprinklers, and it works pretty well actually. So once you've extracted your honey, you've got all these empty supers, and you want to make sure you protect them. A lot of people, if you've got a couple supers, they'll put them all back on their bees to let the bees kind of clean up all the drips, and then they'll pull all of them off, but 1, or really 2, so that the bees don't need 3 or 4 or 5 boxes on top of them over the summer unless they're filling them up. But usually once you've extracted honey, you'll have your deep brood box, and then you'll have 1 box above that, like I talked about, and everything else you can put into storage after the bees have kind of cleaned them up a little bit. And for storing empty supers, you can preserve them in a freezer. If you've got a ton of freezer space, you can just store them in a freezer. If you don't, then you can use wax moth crystals to keep wax moths out of them. And you're going to need to replenish those wax moth crystals about every 6 weeks or so, because they will kind of evaporate out of those supers. And then if you've got them stored in a vertical stack, so kind of like that bottom picture there of me with a stack when I was about 15 years younger. And then if you've got them in a stack like that, it's a great way to store them. I wouldn't do it outside. I would do it in your garage or in a storage shed. You can just have a solid bottom, stack up your honey supers, get an old sock, fill it full of wax moth crystals, put it in that top box, put a lid on, and then replenish them about every 6 weeks, and that'll keep the wax moths out. If you just got a couple supers, then a great thing to do is just get a trash bag, like a big trash bag, put your 2 or 3 supers in that trash bag, put a sock full of, a child sock full of wax moth crystals if you've only got a couple supers in that bag, and then seal that bag. And you shouldn't have to treat again as long as it stays sealed. And you'd want to store that in a garage or in a storage shed out of the direct heat, of course. So storing those, protecting that comb is really important because wax moths really love that comb. So make sure you get those wax moth crystals, keep those protected so that wax moths don't eat all that comb that your bees work so hard to make. Real quick note on wax moth damage. This is what I would consider severe wax moth damage. This little video here, they can be so severe that they can eat the comb completely off the foundation to where there's nothing but foundation left, and they can really make a mess. So if it's that severe, you can try to. You're going to have to completely scrape everything off of those frames, recoat them with beeswax, and then try again next year. This is more minor. This next picture is more minor wax moth damage where they've kind of just created some webbing through the comb. They haven't really consumed it all like that previous picture. If you're seeing this, then you need to freeze those supers or those frames. That'll kill all the eggs and larvae, and then store them in those wax moth crystals. The wax moth crystals can't kill the wax moths. It only repels them. So if you've got active wax moths, you got to freeze those frames and then use the wax moth crystals. You do not want to use mothballs. So don't use mothballs. It's a totally different product. Mothballs will hurt bees. The wax moth crystals won't. Next year, when you're ready to use these supers, you're going to want to let them air out for about a week or so before putting these supers back on the hive to make sure that the crystals and the smell has completely evaporated. So a best control method for wax moths and small hive beetles is just a strong hive as far as controlling them inside the hive. Now your stored honeycomb, we just talked about that. In a living colony, you don't ever want to put those crystals in a living colony because it'll drive the bees out. But the best way to keep wax moths and small hive beetles out of a living colony is just having a strong hive. A strong hive should be able to keep them at bay, no problem. Wax moths and small hive beetles are kind of like the buzzards of the beekeeping industry. They don't actually go in and kill things. They'll just move in and make a mess when something else has already killed or weakened your hive to the point where they can get a foothold. So keeping your hive strong is the most successful way to keep the wax moths and small hive beetles out. You can use a beetle trap. I've referenced those earlier in that picture to the left there. It just fits right between your frames, and you put a little bit of oil in the bottom of it, and the small hive beetles crawl in and die. So great method, especially if you've got pollen patties on your hive, to put a couple of those little traps in there, and they come with instructions on how to install them. Real cheap, real simple, and it'll help keep the small hive beetles at bay. But again, a strong hive in most cases is going to be able to take care of it, no problem. I think this is the last slide, and just a reminder for making sure you've got water sources provided for your bees. Oh, it's not the last slide, I lied. It's almost the last. Bees got to have water. I mean, that's one of the ways they keep the hive cool. You know, bees will actually go to a water source, they'll get a drink of water, they'll bring it back to the hive, and then they'll spit that water out and fan their wings and kind of help cool the hive. They also use it in the honey curing process. So water is a really critical part of making sure your hive is able to over summer correctly. Sherry wrote a whole article in the Texas Bee Supply Monthly that just came out about keeping your hives cool and water sources. So I'm going to refer you to that. It was awesome. Gave a lot of tips and tricks on providing a water source for your bees. So I would refer you to that to make sure you've got a water source. If you've got a creek or a pond that doesn't go dry and it's within a quarter mile or so, then the bees can forage on that, no problem. But if you don't, or especially if you live in a neighborhood, you don't want the bees going to your neighbor's swimming pool. So make sure you provide a water source for those bees so that they're not bothering your neighbors. One other quick note I want to make that I didn't include, that I just remembered to mention, is that bees can become a little more aggressive during the summer months. And once all the flowers stop blooming and you've got all those foragers hanging around the hive more, it's not at all uncommon for your hive to become a bit more aggressive. And that's pretty normal. What you'll find though is if you're feeding that trickle method, then they tend to calm back down because they've got more of a continual flow of food. But if they really start running out of food and it gets really hot, really dry, they tend to become more aggressive over the summer. And then they calm back down in the fall, winter, and spring. So your hive's also a lot bigger in the summertime. You know, in the spring, they're smaller, they're growing, they're distracted by flowers. You hit this July period and they're full strength. There's nothing for them to do. There's no flowers for them to be distracted by, and they can get a little more aggressive. So make sure you're suiting up properly when you go out there. Make sure your smoker's working properly. Make sure you know how to light it properly. Make sure the neighbor isn't mowing his yard or his field next door when you're going through your bees. And then I really like to go through my bees early in the morning or late in the evening this time of year. I just, for my own sake, a lot of Sherry's article about in the Texas Bee Supply Monthly was also about keeping you safe, because we're putting on these big heavy bee suits and going out when it's really hot. And so for your sake and for the bees' sake, I really like going out early in the morning or late in the evening when it's cooler and not disturbing them in the heat of the day. Because honestly, if your hive, especially if they're in full sun and you're going through those frames and you set a frame out for 5-10 minutes, that comb can melt. I mean, it can literally just melt away in the full sunlight. So, but early in the morning or late in the evening, it's not going to do that. So, and you'll be much more comfortable too. So, okay, a couple quick reminders, and then we're going to, once I get through this, I'm going to jump back and answer questions that you guys had. If Sherry and James weren't able to get to all of them, and you can certainly keep posting questions, and I'll get to all of them that I possibly can. We probably won't get to all your questions because there's in the low hundreds of people on this call. So you can send them to help@texasbeesupply.com. And we get a lot of emails there, so it might take us a day or two, but we'll get to those as quickly as we can. The follow-up email that you'll hopefully get tomorrow is going to have a registration link for the August call. It's going to have a link to all the products and videos that we did, and it's going to have a free link to the Texas Bee Supply Monthly Magazine. So one thing I want to do real quick before you guys start signing off is I want to jump back on here, and here we go. And I want to do a quick little poll with you guys, because I want to know what interests all of you when it comes to what you would like to see in upcoming webinars. Because like I mentioned earlier, I mean, we want to do really practical in the beginning, but then in the last half of the webinar, we want to be able to talk about more specific things you're interested in. So go ahead and vote. It's multiple choice. So pick the top 5 things you would like to see, that you would like to learn about. And that'll help direct us in August and the rest of the webinars what to talk about. So I'm going to give just another 30-40 seconds here for you guys to fill that out. Just pick your top 5 things that you would like to see. And if you have other suggestions, feel free to email us anytime, and we'd love to hear what you would like to learn about, because these are for you guys. We want to make them as beneficial as we possibly can for you guys. So so yeah, always feel free to let us know how we can help you guys. So I'm going to let this run just a couple more seconds, and then I'm going to jump over and answer any questions that you guys have. And we've got about 15 minutes left, so I can probably get to a lot of your questions. And then we'll sign off. We'll try to sign off on time. But again, I just really appreciate you guys jumping on here and giving us your evening, because it's a lot of fun for us too, and it's a great way to interact with you guys. So, okay, it looks like that is about everybody. So thanks for voting. Lots of great votes on there. I think it's pretty clear what we're going to be talking about. So I'm going to go ahead and end that poll, and we will start getting to your questions. Okay, so it looks like requeening was number 1. So that's kind of cool. So we will definitely tackle requeening next time, and then finding a queen was big, and so cool. We'll make some videos for these too. So thank you guys for sharing all that. All right, so let's get to some questions here. And wow, James and Sherry, you guys have been busy. So it looks like you guys got to 70 questions, and there's about 30 here left, so feel free to keep asking them. So Julie, you said you read in the newsletter to put a toothpick in the cover to help it ventilate. I assume this means the inner cover. So yeah, so when you're cracking, when you're putting a space between the inner cover and the bottom box, yeah, about a toothpick or so width is enough to just give the bees a little bit of upper airflow. So yeah, between the inner cover and that bottom box, that is correct. That's the correct answer. Joe, you asked, the only red pollen you know of is from bluebonnets, but those are finished now. In the winter, they bring in a cool, vibrant fuchsia, which is from henbit. So yeah, I mean, you are correct. I mean, elm can be kind of a dusty orangish red color, but the pure red is from bluebonnet. Yeah. Hap, you said your honey super is pretty full and they're just now starting to cap. About 20% is cap. Should I wait until they cap a lot more before I pull the honey? So capped honey, you know, your honey doesn't all have to be capped. It can be just partially capped, because sometimes when it gets really hot, the bees kind of run out of energy and resources to cap all the honey. So we actually wrote a whole article about this in the magazine about when to harvest honey. And we've also got a couple of videos about it on our web video blog. So check those out, and that's going to give you a really thorough explanation of how to know if it's ready, even if it's uncapped. So great question. What is the blue type feeder on the ground in the video? I'm not sure. If it was blue, it probably wasn't a feeder, so it may have been something else. So, Bobby, you said, can I take honey frames from one of your stronger hives, which may be getting a little honey bound, and move it to a less strong hive? Absolutely. So not only can you equalize with brood and shake the bees off and move brood between hives, you can do the same thing with honey. So if you've got a lot of capped honey, it's strong hives kind of becoming honey bound, you can shake all the bees off, and then you can move that frame of honey over into a weaker hive. Absolutely. Kevin, you've seen a number of people say to keep hives in full sun. What is best if I have no shade in the yard? So yeah, it's pretty common. You know, a lot of people talk about, you know, hives should be in full sun. And one of the big reasons is small hive beetles tend to do a little bit better in the shade. So, you know, and I agree, most of the year I like to have hives in full sun, but our Texas summers are just brutal. And so, you know, I would say October through June, I like to have my hives in full sun. But those summer months, even some partial winter evening, afternoon shade is just ideal. So if you don't have shade nearby, and you don't want to move your bees in and out of shade, you can just kind of create a little shade screen, kind of like they have over playgrounds. Beach umbrellas work great, and they can be cheap. They've got some like $7 ones on Amazon, so you can get a little beach umbrella and give your bees a little bit of lemonade. Your neighbors will think you're nuts, but beekeepers will think it's great. So, but you can actually give them some artificial shade too. Diana, you said, how long should I keep the wet supers on the hive to get cleaned up? 24 hours. I mean, it doesn't take the bees long at all to fully clean up those supers. Do the hives you're selling this summer have a screen bottom board? Yeah, so all the hives we're currently selling and will sell throughout the summer, they're in brand new equipment and they've all got screen bottom boards. Jason, you have 2 deeps and 1 honey super on top. The bees just began to move into the super. Will that result in early fall honey harvest? So Jason, it kind of depends on where you are. Some areas don't have much of a fall honey flow. If you're in Southeast Texas, then there's a good chance you might actually make a honey crop in the fall. If you're in North Texas, it's pretty rare that we have a fall honey flow good enough to fill up a super. It does happen, but it's a bit unusual. Dawn, you said, when do you add a queen excluder? So Dawn, queen excluders you really want to use in the springtime when your bees are bringing in surplus honey that you're going to eat. So usually your queen excluder goes on in late April, early May. And then as soon as you harvest honey in early July, you're going to take that off completely, and you're not going to want to put that back on until they're making surplus honey again the following year. Nancy, in a stack of supers that are stored, do wax moth crystals go in the bottom or in each super? So those wax moth crystals, you know, you can put them in that sock. You're going to want to put them in the very top, and the fumes kind of fall down through the honey super. So put them on the very top, and it should, as long as it's not more than 7 or 8 supers high, it should take care of them, no problem. Stephen, corn is wind pollinated, correct? Yeah, I was curious if the bees would still collect the pollen for food. So bees will forage on corn. It's a horrible pollen source for them. I mean, I've seen tests on the protein and the quality of corn pollen, and it's terrible. So not a great pollen source for the bees. Stephen, how do the moths get in the stack of supers if you have a solid bottom board and there are no holes for the moths to get in? Shouldn't one treatment of moth crystals be sufficient? So yeah, if you've got a big stack of honey supers, it depends on how tight your woodenware is. If you've got all brand new woodenware, there's a good chance it is tight enough that those moths can't get in to lay eggs. But if you've got a little crack somewhere, or if it's shifted a little bit, then those moths can slip in pretty easily. So you can treat them once and then just check them every week or two. And if you're not seeing signs of wax moths, you should be okay. So you may be fine with one treatment. The big thing is just to keep an eye on them. And if you've got cracks, or if they're, if you've got older woodenware and it's cracked or something, you're going to want to treat about every 6 weeks to keep it out. Kevin, what if a hive is getting a few field roaches in it? No big deal. They coexist quite well. So I don't really worry about roaches or spiders. Sometimes you see all sorts of things living between the telescoping cover and the bottom board. I'm sorry, the telescoping cover and the inner cover. And that's pretty common, not a big deal. Let's see, Brenda, you started beekeeping this spring and your hive has 2 deep boxes. The bees had to draw out all the frames in the top box, and it's now pretty full of bees and a lot of nectar. Great, that's wonderful. Not any brood. The bottom box is full of bees and not as much brood as I would have expected. You've been feeding syrup each week. Should you add a medium box and plan to add pollen patties? So yeah, so what I would do is I would almost completely stop feeding. I would give them pollen patties. And I would put a medium box on top. It sounds like they're probably a little overfed. So give them that pollen patty, give them a little more space, and let them eat up some of that food, and that queen should kind of jumpstart again. Let's see, Jim, can you call Blake the skinny bee man? You're not the first. I've gotten that a lot. So absolutely. And you know what? As I'm getting older and older, it's more and more of a compliment. So go for it. Brenda, what does honeybound mean? Honeybound is just when the bees are filling that brood nest with honey instead of brood. And so if those middle, I'm going to say those middle 6 frames or so in the bottom box are being filled with honey instead in the center instead of brood, that's when it looks like they're honeybound. So yeah, so it's just when they're bringing and storing in a lot of syrup or nectar into the brood nest where the brood should be. Holly, can you have a copy of these questions and answers be provided along with the follow-up email? Really good question. I think so. I think Zoom allows us to copy all that. If they do, I'll attach it onto that email. So great question. Melinda, thank you. Well, you're very welcome. Henry, any pictures of small hive beetles? Yeah, Henry, there were some pictures in this presentation, and so we'll send you the recording of this, and there's actually some videos. You probably couldn't see them very well because the videos don't stream well through Zoom, but that'll be included in the follow-up email. You can watch this recording over again, and you should be able to stream those videos a little more easily. Let's see, Brenda, when you suggest the bees should have 30 pounds of honey stored in the second box, do you mean capped honey? Or does that include cells of nectar too? Doesn't matter. So if it's at 30 pounds, it can be capped, it can be uncapped, doesn't matter. Eventually the bees will cap it. But if it's uncapped at the moment, that's fine. Cheryl, your brood box is so full that you're unable to pull frames out. What should you do? So yeah, so one thing you got to do is every time you leave your brood nest, you want to shove all those frames really tightly together. If you don't shove frames tightly together after each inspection, the bees will just keep widening out those combs to where it's really hard to pull them out. So if you've got 10 frames in your box right now, then I would pull one frame out and just keep it at 9. Or if you've got 8, if you've got 9 currently, you can pull one frame out and keep it at 8. You just really got to keep those frames pushed together tightly from here on out, and that'll give you a little more working room. So hopefully that answers your question. Jody, you have a new hive and you don't want to harvest the honey. What do I do then over the summer to help them get ready for winter? Y'all are putting an empty super on top of the brood. You already have 2 deeps. What should I do to prep them for winter? Great question. So this is pretty common. So let's say you didn't harvest honey your first year. You've already got a second box on the hive, and you don't want to keep feeding because it's already full of food. So in that case, I would definitely do the pollen patties. I would definitely do the mite treatment. I would do the Pro-DFM, and then if it were me, I would still maybe give them maybe 1/4 of a gallon of syrup, definitely 1-to-1, so a very thin syrup, maybe 1/4 of a gallon every 3 weeks or so, just to kind of give them a little something. And then you could also add a 3rd box and do the trickle method and let them go ahead and fill up that 3rd box, and that's going to kind of keep them rolling. So someone says, you see the queen cell has a larva inside. What should you do? Does that mean the queen has a problem? So if you're seeing queen cells in your hive, and they have larvae inside of them, I would ask first if you've got eggs in your hive. If you're seeing eggs and you've got a good laying queen, she's got a good pattern, then you can try wiping out that cell and see if that works. They might be getting ready to swarm. If that's the case, the only real way to prevent the hive from swarming is splitting the hive. That's the only real way to shut down the swarming impulse. Shoot us some pictures of your brood nest and to that help email address, and I'll take a look and see if I can help you a little bit further. Someone said that, oh, the blue feeder you guys saw on the ground was a bulk pollen feeder. Yes, thank you. That's what that was for. I thought you meant syrup feeder, but yeah, it's a pollen feeder. Matthew, when do you add a second medium? Do you do it when the previous medium is 80% full? You are correct. Yes. Any summer tips? Let's see. I'm not sure what TBH's is. Katie said you're building a war hive and it has some wobble to it. Will the gap be too much of a problem with letting tiny critters in? Nope, no problem at all. Bees are great at sealing up all the gaps with propolis in hives that they don't want there. So not a big deal at all. Justin, are swarm cells a good sign of a strong hive? Haven't had any eggs laid, but continually destroying swarm cells every 3 to 4 weeks. So if you're seeing empty cells, those are what we call emergency queen cups. So that's just where they're building them just in case they need them. So if there's nothing in those queen cups, not a big deal at all. Just means that they have them there just in case. If there's something in them, they might be prepping for swarming. But if they're empty, not a big deal. They just do that in case of emergency. John, do you have a technique for lifting full deep boxes to place in apivar strips? They seem to weigh 100 pounds. So yeah, those boxes get really, really heavy. The best thing I can do, recommend is that you just kind of tip it up on end instead of trying to pick it up and take it off. You can kind of tip it up and stick those strips down while you're holding it up. That works. Those deeps are just heavy. That's why a lot of folks use mediums, just because the deeps are so heavy. But getting some help is always a good idea. You can buy a lifter where actually a person gets on each side and you can kind of, it's a little handle you can use to lift up the deep. That might be helpful for you. Let's see, Russell, you said, do you recommend feeding dry sugar during winter since it's too cold for syrup? Not really. I really just prefer the syrup. I really prefer prepping them ahead of time, making sure they've got that 30-pound surplus going into winter. We'll talk more about the sugar feeding and winter feeding in future webinars, but not really. Lee, you said, do you offer packaged bees since you have a lot of woodenware? We don't. The reason that we don't sell packaged bees is just because you can buy a Nook for about the same cost, and a Nook has as many bees as a package of bees, and it has a laying queen and a couple frames of brood and a couple frames of honey. So it's way better value really to buy a Nook and for basically the same price. So usually we might start selling them next year just because a lot of people ask for them, but I love selling Nooks because it's such a better value for beekeepers. So okay, so we're gonna stop there just because it's 8 o'clock or a little bit past. So I want to thank you guys for joining. If I can get these questions and share them, I'll do that. But I want to thank you guys for jumping on. Go ahead and sign up for our August webinar and the email that we'll send out to you guys tomorrow. And I hope you guys have a fantastic 4th of July and stay safe. And with that, I'd like to thank James and Sherry for answering a ton of questions. And we will see you guys hopefully in a month on our next call. Have a great night, guys.